Okay. So the goal for today is to introduce you to group policies in a network environment. You have done group policies on a local computer, and you at least got exposed to it, possibly if you're in PC Support 2. I'm going to assume that you don't know that, so if some of this is review, well, you just get it as review then. But we're looking specifically at the network Active Directory environment, so group policies on a network, on a server, Windows Server 2016 specifically is what we're working with. What I'm going to do today is give you an overview of group policies, what it looks like, the management tool, of how we create them, of how we manage them, how we link them, how we can block the inheritance, of how we can, basically override the blocking of inheritance. And then after that, we'll get into the actual content of the group policy itself, the objects themselves, and the various things you can do. We'll then go into some specific examples of applying some specific group policies and seeing of their implications. That's kind of what we're looking at doing today. So looking at group policies, the purpose of group policy is to manage users and computers in the Windows environment. So group policies only apply in the Windows environment, so it doesn't work with the Mac operating system or tablets or other hand portable devices. It's working with just Windows devices. But you can control devices based on who is logged onto them, so that's kind of the user side of the policy, or you can based on which computer is being used. So like take, for example, a computer in a lobby, like a kiosk type of computer. You can apply a policy to it so that no matter who logs in, these are the restrictions that are going to happen to it. You can do it the other way around, that I will have certain restrictions or abilities to do things on a computer no matter which computer I log on to. So when we work with group policies, we're working with two sides of the group policy, the computer aspect of it and the user part of it. And sometimes both, and there could be conflicts, and we'll talk about how the conflicts are resolved. When we talk about group policies, it is pretty much controlling that device at every single level that you can possibly think of. From if you have a start button, what icons or applications are on the start button, what's on the system tray, the whole environment thing, what screensaver you have, what background you have, what's your screensaver timeout going to be, what applications you can run, what applications you can install, who can log on to that computer, when you can log on to that computer, if you can use any different specific devices, if you can use USB devices, if you can use optical drives or not. You have complete control of that person's registry. So if you think of the power of the registry and everything the registry does, you have complete ultimate control of everything. So it's pretty extensive. We'll be looking at a couple of specific examples that are kind of common, some things that we actually use in the classroom and are common in many environments, but then also giving you a chance to explore and coming up with your own group policy settings that kind of look cool and interesting, ability to explore with that. Just a quick question, when you're thinking of group policies and you think of what they apply to in Active Directory, which object do you think we would be kind of connecting or linking with in the Active Directory environment? Think of group policies. Group policies. Groups. Yeah, one would think that, and I deliberately led you down that trail because it's wrong. Yes, Nathan. Organizational units. So when we're working with applying a group policy, they're done completely at the organizational unit level. So I have no idea whether they're not called organizational unit policies, because that's exactly what they are. They're not group policies. They have nothing to do with groups whatsoever. So when we have a users group called managers, we cannot apply group policies to them. We also cannot apply group policies to an individual person. They can only be applied to organizational units. So therefore, if you wanted a specific person to have specific policy applied to them, you'd have to create their own organizational unit, put them in it, and then apply it at that level. So we're going to take a look at the group policy tool, a management tool, and then seeing exactly how you create them, how the structure is laid out, and then we through the process of actually linking them. So I'm going to log into my DC1. Oh, that's my DC1. This is my DC1. So I'm going to log into DC1. And I'm using a group policy management tool. So once Server Manager launches, up in the Tools menu, I'll have Group Policy Management. Group Policy Management is right here. Realize that anything that's under the Tools menu, again, this is just a side note, anything that's in the Tools menu under Server Manager is also found on the Start menu. It's just Server Manager is always running on your server, so it's just a really handy way to get there. But everything's on the Start menu as well. If you go to the Start button, and then I go to Windows Administrative Tools, you have all the same tools underneath here, including Group Policy Management. So anyway, so I'm waiting for Group Policy Management to load here. And it's not. Let's try it again. And this is what you get. Group Policy Management. Yeah. Get updates. Right. There you go. Yeah, I wish we did have a day we could just set to updates. Unfortunately, Microsoft will determine when they want to do updates.
Well,
It's not a consistent, yeah.
I was gonna say, like, we ourselves set aside, like, an hour.
To do all the updates.
Just apply the updates.
So if I look underneath here, it's going to show me my forest. And if you remember the whole directory structure, hierarchical structure, we have forest, and then forest goes down to domains. And so if I had multiple forests, they would show up in here. If I had multiple domains within a forest, they would show up here as well. But I only have a single domain. And these are my organizational units that I'm working with. You can see that a couple things are specifically missing. If I go to Tools and then Active Directory Users and Computers, I'll put this over here and I'll click over here. You'll notice that, I have accounting and animals. This built-in one is missing. That's because it's a built-in container. You'll also notice that computers is missing. And that's where all my computers are. And we'll talk a little bit later on about, some possible solutions, how to deal with that. But there's no computer container. So that means I cannot apply any group policies to these computers specifically. So I'll look at linking a little bit later on in the flowing down, and we'll come back and address that. So I have domain controllers, executive. Here's another container. It's a foreign security principles. That's a container. That's not going to show up over here. Managed services and users are also containers. Those don't show up underneath here. So that users container and that computers container will have an impact later on of how do you get things to apply to users that are still in the users container or computers that are still in the computers container if they're not in an organizational unit that we can apply them to. So if you look over here, though, I do have one called Group Policy Objects, and this is where your actual group policy objects are. Your group policy objects are all listed there. In this case, when you build a server, two of them are built in by default. One is the default domain policy, and the second one is the default domain controllers policy. So the default domain policy applies to everything on the domain, and that is because it is linked to the domain. And we can see that it's linked to the domain by going right up here. So here's my domain. Right underneath it is my default domain policy that is linked to that domain. Because of the whole process of inheritance, it does flow down to everything that's inside of here, including everything over here, the computers and users containers over here as well. Okay. So that is how those things can apply. You can only apply things to computers and users if, in fact, they're applied to the domain itself and through inheritance having flowing down. There's nothing I can do specifically with these computers or users because right now they're just in a container, not an organizational unit. I can also see this by clicking on the gopa.com, and here's the status, but here's my linked policies. So you can have multiple linked policies on here, and I'll show that to you a little bit later on as well. But it's showing you that this policy is linked and the link is enabled. And enabling the link means that it is running. So it means that is going to apply. I also have another group policy down here called Default Domain Controllers Policy. And that does, in fact, get linked to the Domain Controllers organizational unit. And if I look over here, unfortunately, within group policy management, it doesn't show you the contents of any of these. It's like, well, who's in domain controllers? It's not like you can see who's inside of there. You'd have to switch back over to users and computers to see who that is. It's like, oh, that's my DC1 and DC2. Those are domain controllers, so you're going to have special policies applied to them. And we're going to look at the contents of policies later on. We're just looking at how to manage them as an object and linking them to begin with, though. So domain controller object has a default domain controller policy. So it's going to apply special policies to everything in that container that aren't going to be applied to everything else. So working with group policies, we want to be able to create group policy objects themselves. And one way of doing it is just going to the group policy object area. This is my container of all the objects. And I can just go ahead and create a new object. And just purely for example of working with objects themselves, not working with the contents of them, I'm going to make one called animal policy. Animals policy. And so it's just a policy that I'm thinking that are going to apply to all the animals that I have in my organizational unit. So once I have a policy created, and then I'll look at editing later on, but just since I have a policy there, I can then apply that or link that to any organizational unit that I wanted to be applied to. In this case, if I wanted animals to have that policy linked to it, I can just right click on it and I'll say link an existing GPO. So if I've created the GPO already, group policy object is what GPO stands for. If I've already created the group policy object, I just link to it and then it shows me the all my options. So I can click on animals and now I have linked that policy to there. You can link policies to as many objects as you want. So I can go to HR and I can link an existing one and I'll put the animal policy there as well. And maybe under sales, there are a bunch of animals over there. And so that is how you can link the objects to multiple locations. So that means that that policy would apply to human resources, to sales, but not operations, not IS. So whatever's going on in there would only happen to those users or computers that are located within that organizational unit. You can also have, you can also create group policies right at the container that you want to apply them to. So if I know that I'm making a brand new group policy object for the animals, I can right click on here and choose the first option, which says create the GPO and link it here. So it does that whole create the animals and then link it two-step process and do it in one. So I just click on there and well, what's the name of the new policy? I'll just call it animals 2 just because I can't think of anything more creative. Animals 2. And now it creates the policy. The policy still exists under group policy objects. That's where all the objects exist. This is the real location of them. But if I look under animals, now I have two policies that are applied. So, yes, question?
Do you have to put policy?
Excellent question. Do you have to put policy at the end of that name? Absolutely not. That is just kind of the standard way of doing it. If you look at the group policy object, here's the animals policy, here's the default domain policy, domain controller policy, here's this policy, here's the, the sales policy. It just is very clear what it is. But you can make it, Bob. Or you can even say this is not a policy, and still is a policy. So you can name it anything you want. This is a file. It's not, it's a policy. But Yes, yes. You can name it anything that you want. It's just kind of natural that what's contained inside of here, well, that is the default domain policy. So it's just kind of a common naming convention, but by no means, mandatory. I could just name it, 1 or A. If you know what those are, wonderful. So just being clear in your documentation and your naming conventions just make it easier to work with later on. So if also you start, applying, linking a group policy, I'll do that one and that one. And so now I have, these different policies on here. So, okay. So another thing you'll notice is that you have a link order, and these are processed in the order that they come up. So it's going to look at the animals policy, and there's literally thousands of entries in a group policy, and it goes through all of them and it applies the things that say that they need to be applied, and then it goes to the next policy and applies the next ones, and then it goes to the third one in that order. It is possible that you might have conflicting policies. One policy might say you can be allowed to do this, and the second one says you can't be allowed to do this. Well, it goes in that order. So if you're allowed to do something and then the next policy that runs says you're not allowed to, then you're not allowed to. If the third one gives you the option to do it again, to turn it back on, basically, you can do it again. It's really best to come up with policies that don't conflict. These really shouldn't be massively complex policies. Well, actually, there's different trains of thoughts on this. I like to keep things pretty simple in that I want a policy to do something. So this policy denies the ability to use any devices on your computer. And that's it. I don't want it to be mixed in with my login policies or my other account restriction policies. It's just I want that policy because it's very clear. And I want that to apply to my salespeople because I don't want data to be leaked or stolen or whatever. I might have another policy that deals with, they're very, very broad in general, like the whole login process. What you see when you get the login prompt. That might apply to everybody, but that might be its own policy then. But then you can see where those things apply. And those things obviously don't conflict. I mean, they have nothing to do with each other. The other train of thought, though, is that the more policies you have to run through, the more complex, the more time it can take to process and whatever. So there's a lot of thoughts on combining policies, which then could lead to potential conflicts. But you just have to understand what you have and be able to document it and figure out what's going on. You can change these orders. If I want the animal policy to be last, I just choose the animal policy and I move it down the list. I can move up and down individually or put it first, or I can put it last. So there you have complete, very granular control of how these things are applied. Yes, David?
So usually you'll put your general policies higher on the list than specific?
Absolutely. Excellent insight. Yes, the very general ones be first because that's going to apply to everybody. And then as you might apply more specific ones, you go further down because those are the ones that you want to be applied there. Absolutely. And I do not want to get super deep into that complexity part. I just want to introduce this to you. We're going to make very general, kind of broad scope group policies. There's all kinds of nitty-gritty stuff you can get into and whatever. We're not going to play a whole lot with that. So let me just talk a little bit about, so this is linking them. How do you get rid of a link? Well, two things you can do. So all of a sudden, you throw this new A policy in, and boy, just things aren't just right at all. Like, something happened. I just applied this new policy. I thought it was going to be cool, not working well. So you have a couple options. The first option is to right-click on the link and just disable the link. So you uncheck link enabled. And when you do that, you'll notice in this list over here, link enabled, it says yes, no, yes. So right now, that is still in the list, but it's not going to be applied. So the group policy will not run. It's not going to look at it. It's going to skip right over the top of it. So if you need to fix it then, you can, and then you can come back later, and then you can link enable it again, and then give it another shot, and then see how it goes from there. That's a real quick, easy way of stopping something from happening, and then allowing it to happen kind of back and forth very quickly. Another way of doing it is just simply to delete it from the list. You know, not a huge difference. I can go right from here and I can delete it. Now, the biggest issue or the biggest concern people have is that when you right click, I see this A policy and I click delete, people think they're deleting the policy. Fortunately, the dialog box is very, very clear to help alleviate any concerns with that. Do you want to delete this link? This will not delete the GPO itself. So Microsoft has done a fantastic job of alleviating the fear or even the mistake of actually deleting the group policy object. It says you're deleting the link, not the GPO itself. And now it's off the list. And then if you wanted to apply it again, you just go to right click on HR, link an existing GPO, choose A, and now it's back on the list. Put it back in the second position. So whether you right click and disable the link or delete it, then add it back again later, it's not a huge difference. But you can see two different ways of not having it apply. If you really want to get rid of the group policy itself, that would be done under the group policy objects container. So I have all these objects. I'm not using these anymore, or whatever. This is where you would in fact right click and delete. And again, the dialog box is very clear. Do you want to delete this GPO and all the links to it in this domain? It does say that it will not delete links in other domains. We don't have other domains, so we don't really care. But yes, I do. And then when you do that, you'll notice that it is gone from HR. So that one policy is gone. If I want to delete the A one, the same thing. I can delete the A policy and it deletes the A policy, so it's just not under there. You can do other things with policies. You can rename them. Maybe Bob isn't quite as clear as you thought it was going to be, and so maybe you want to make it you know, canines, or actually I probably should rename it canine policy, just to keep somewhat consistent. I'll get rid of some of these other ones too. Excellent question. The question was, well, it's like, well, this is obviously locked or blocked that you can't delete your default policy. Not true. It's just a policy. And if you notice, there's no undo. There's no like oops. There's no policy recycle bin. A1, this is a file, this is not a policy. Those policies are gone. There is no getting those back. Unless you did a snapshot of your server and then you're reverting your entire server, operating system, users, and everything and all. Correct. So. Oh, so if I got rid of my default domain policy,
Yeah, would you be able to do anything?
absolutely, absolutely. Domains tend to be restrictive more than permissive. So they usually restrict you from doing things. So even the default domain policy, by the way, when you created your whole user account, when you created your, okay, I'm sorry, back up. My mind is a little bit slow here. Okay, we installed Windows Server 2016, and it said you had to create an administrator account password. The administrator user is the first user created automatically. Did you have to put a complex password in, or could you use a simple password? It had to be complex. Did you know that that is a default domain policy requirement? If you did not have a default domain policy, you could put a simple password in there. So you can thank that policy to force you to do that right off the bat. Because having a complex password is a policy item. Not having that policy enabled means that you can have anything you want as a password, even a simple password or no password. So things like that. And we'll take a look at the contents of those in just a bit. So we'll actually see what those existing ones have by default and like why we even have those things. And then even the default domain controller policy, those are even more restrictive. So yes, if you had no policies, you could function completely, but probably a little too much control. Let's see here. Okay, things are inherited down, so they do flow down. So anything done at the default domain policy flows down into all these organizational units. Anything within, like here's sales. Here's an example of a sales policy. Let me actually switch this one around a little bit to make it maybe a little bit more realistic. Here's a sales policy. So I'm applying the sales policy to the sales organizational unit, and I will delete the animals policy from the sales. So now sales has a sales policy that will flow down into all the users for east and west as well. So if I wanted to stop that for some reason, canine, felines. How many of you have a cat? Do rules apply to cats?
Yeah.
No, they don't. They're just in their own little world. They're like, yeah, those policies are fine for the rest of the animal kingdom, but you know what? I'm in my own world. I'm not going to follow any of those. And you can actually say block inheritance. And so the feline or organization unit says, I'm blocking it. So all those animal policies don't apply to me. So basically all of these policies will no longer apply to anybody in the felines. So, and again, looking under felines, who is that? That would be my Fluffy, Kitty, and Max. They're going to be all their own thing. So you can block inheritance. So you can stop the flow down from there, and then if you wanted to have its own policy, here I'll just, actually I think I already have one called feline. Oh no, I didn't. So let me create a new one, create a new GPO, and link it. I'll call it the feline policy, which will have no restrictions because that's just where they roll. But you can see that the policy is really created in the policy list and just linked underneath the feline. Now, we've done this before already. We've done this in organizational units. We did this in the file system. We blocked inheritance. We didn't allow inheritance to flow on down. And kind of the same thing. We did it like an access control list at that level to make a new policy to go from there. So we do have one extra kind of nuclear option, though, that with group policies that ignores blocking of inheritance. We don't have that in the Active Directory system, and we really didn't have it in the file system, but we do have it in group policies. This animals policy, or actually, you know what? I'm going to say animals 2 policy. This animals 2 policy is actually really, really important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to enforce it. And if I enforce a policy, it is going to go through the blocking of inheritance. So yet one more complex thing to keep track of when you're trying to figure out the whole flow of stuff is that you have to be looking at which ones are enforced, not enabled, but enforced, and then which ones the links are enabled, and then figuring out where you have blocked inheritance and which things will flow through or not. So in this case, tell me which policies will apply to Max. Animals 2. And feline. Right. So if all of a sudden Max can do something, you're going to have to figure that out and realize it's coming from one of those 2 policies. It's coming from the feline policy because it's done right at that organizational level, but realize that the animals 2 is enforced, so it's going through the block of inheritance, and so it could be something going on the animal 2 policy. So this gets extremely complicated, and in the real world, you could be potentially spending a lot of time going through all these layers and inheritance and blocking and enforcing and figuring out where things are. That's not the goal of today at all. It's just to expose you to these levels of complexity, though, to be aware of it so when you do get into the real world. We're going to keep things pretty simple, though, and just kind of work with one group policy object itself. So That is an overview of group policy objects themselves, looking at the group policy management, of how to create group policies, of how to link them, of how to rename them, of how to delete the link, of how to delete the group policy object, how to block the inheritance, and how to override the blocking of inheritance. So that's kind of all the flow. So we're going to take a break. When we come back from the break, we're going to talk about the contents of group policies and actually see the impact of them. Okay, what we're going to do now then is take a look at the contents of a group policy object and see kind of some of the things that are there. Just to give you an example, we're going to take a look at what's inside the default domain policy to begin with. To see the contents of a policy, any link or the actual object itself, so I can choose the link or I can go down to the group policy object. I can right click on them and say edit. So you don't have to be right on the policy, you can edit the link as well. Edit on the link. Realize that you are editing the policy, not just that instance of it. So this is not an instance of the policy, this is just a link to the policy. So anywhere that you're editing that policy will edit that policy. If I was going to take a look at the default domain policy, if I click on OK, I'm not going to edit, I'm sorry. Let me back up and let's show you what the settings are currently. And the settings currently under the default domain policy, so if I just click on the link for default domain policy, I have scope, which means it applies to all of GOPA. And there's some other details about the object itself, but settings is the most important part that we're looking at. And I don't know why this comes up on my virtual machine. This has not happened in real life, but I have an Internet Explorer issue for whatever reason. But it shows you the policy things that are created. So the default domain policy applies these settings. So the first policy has to do, first set of them has to do with the password policy. And so this is the one that says enforced password history is 24 days. So you cannot go, cat, dog, or even dog 1, 2, 3, dog 1, 2, 3, dog, it does 24 of them. So you'd have to do dog 1, dog 2, dog 3, dog 4, dog 24, and then come up with the dog 1. By the way, no one knows what that is. You do because you created it, but that is not told to the user. So if they say dog 1 and then dog 2 and then go back to dog 1, it says you can't use a password that you've already used. It doesn't say you can't use your past 24, so they don't know that. So in reality, they could do dog 1 through 24 and then do dog over and over and over again. But they don't know that. You can change that, by the way, to have more or less, I believe. The maximum password age, this is when it expires. So that's why 42 days into the semester, all of a sudden it starts saying that your administrator password needs to be changed. That's because of this group policy setting. The group policy setting says that you have to change the password every 42 days. Another thing you'll notice here is a minimum password age. And there's, we've talked about this in other classes, I believe. This whole point of not allowing people to change the password multiple times in a day is so that you don't do dog 1 through 24 and end up with dog 1 at the end of the day again. And so ultimately not changing your password. It's like, okay, I'll spend the next 2 hours changing my password 24 times just so I get back to my password. And that just says no, you would have to change it only once a day. I am a little leery of this policy. If somebody changes their password on the network and then realize that wasn't a very good password, or all of a sudden, somebody finds it out that day, I want to change it, anytime that I want, but I don't know. This is also where you have your password minimum length is 7 characters. So that was the requirement from here. If you did not have this policy, it would be no characters are required. The complexity is the next one. Password must meet complexity requirement. This is the only policy item that has the password complexity. So it doesn't tell you, It doesn't say require uppercase or require lowercase and have all the individual things. It's one line item that just says meet complexity. Now, in the Microsoft world, must meet complexity, there's 4 categories. There's uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and special characters. To meet the complexity requirement, you have to use 3 of those 4 categories. And that is, I should look this up. I think password length is part of the minimum requirement as well too, regardless of the line above it. But you have to meet 3 of the 4. So you have to have uppercase, lowercase, numbers, or special characters, 3 of those different ones. Store password using reversible encryption, and that's the ability for some systems to reverse the encryption. So that basically means plain text. And it's saying, no, do not allow that. You may not store this in plain text. Other things that are on here, I don't know, account lockout threshold, 0 invalid attempts, which means that it's not going to lock out your account ever. So you could try logging as administrator all day long and it'll never lock the account. This is specifically stating this will not lock the account. Other things here, let's see here. This is under Kerberos policy, which we really don't get into, but here's some things that are enabled. Security options. Allow anonymous name translations, disabled. Not sure what that does. Here's some more system things. So these are things that have been turned on for whatever reason, and those are the default domain policies. So if I go and look at the default domain controller policies, you're actually going to find it more restrictive. In that, here, let me zoom out here, and I thought I could, oh well. Such things as access this computer from the network. Only specific people can access this computer from the network. Allow logon locally. This is a big one. This says that the only people that can log on to this computer locally, like at the console, are domain controllers themselves. There's a print operators group, there's a server operators group, account operators, backup operators, and then the administrators. That is why I can go up to DC1 and log on as administrator. So I'm logged on as administrator right now in DC1. If I went to log on as Daniel, they would not be allowed to log on to DC1. If I try to log in as Ashley, I couldn't log on in DC1 because they're not allowed to do that. We don't want regular people logging on to domain controllers. All kinds of things. Again, only the administrator can do certain things, such as create a page file, or log on as a batch job, or profile single processes, or even shut down the system. Only administrators can shut down the system. So that means that somebody can't walk up and log on and turn off your server. Well, I mean, they can reach behind and pull the power plug, but they can't go through the process. So you can see a lot more restrictions. Other things, it doesn't say anything about the password complexity though, but that's because that's already addressed in the default domain policy, and those flow on down as well. So this is one case that you don't do things redundant. You don't repeat things over that are already taken care of someplace else. So those are some examples of that. Let me take a look at some of these other ones. I'll just take a look at, I don't know, I guess I'll just play. Let me make a new policy. I'll do it right at the domain level. At the domain level. And I'll create one called, how do you spell Paul? P-A-U-L. Paul's policy. So here's my policy, and I'm going to apply it to the entire domain.
Policy.
So if I want to work with that, policy. Oh, I like that. Rename. Policy. So if I go ahead and edit it, it's much like the registry. It's a hierarchical structure. It's laid out in somewhat logical format, though it's usually not something you're going to peruse. So if you're wanting to do something, you're probably not going to start looking at the policy and start jumping around. You're going to look online for some kind of resource saying, you know what, that whole, when I go to my Windows client computer, I really hate the whole idea of having to hit Control Delete on there. Or, you know what, I don't want to remember Daniel on there because, you know, I'm logging as a different person every day or whatever like that. So I'm usually going to look it up and then they're going to tell you this is the path to do it. So with that, taking a look at it, we do have two main categories. One is computers and configuration, and the other one's user configuration. And like I said, most of the things deal with the computer. So this is going to happen on that computer regardless of who logs in. Anything that's in this section applies to the users in that organizational unit, and it's going to apply to every computer no matter which computer they log in. If there's a conflict, it's going to end up that it does actually run in this order. So it's going to do the computer configuration first. It actually applies the computer policy when you boot. So when you turn on the computer, you get the computer policy before anyone logs in. So that policy takes effect immediately on that computer before anything happens to it. The user configuration happens when they log in. So if you think of the order of processing, it's going to do all the computer stuff, and then the person logs in, and then it's going to run all the user stuff. So in most cases, this stuff makes sense. Some of these policies don't make sense, though. Let me just throw out one. If complex password, where do you think I would set that up? Do you think that's a computer thing or a user thing?
You said it doesn't really follow. It's a computer.
Okay, so I did give it away, unfortunately. It is a computer policy, which makes no sense at all. So basically, I can set that computer policy to say you need to have a complex password. So when your password comes up and it needs to be changed, and you're on that computer, you'd have to make it a complex password. Vice versa, that computer over there doesn't have that policy applied to it. You could go and change it to ABC123 or even A. You know, so that would, and then your password's fine regardless of which computer you log on to. So meeting complexity only happens when you're setting or changing passwords. So, okay, looking at computer policies. So if I look at our policies, you know, there's software settings. We spend a lot of time on our Windows settings. I'm just going to go to a couple specific ones, you know, looking at where we're going to end up a lot of times. We end up a lot of times under Windows settings and then security settings. And you can see a lot of things underneath here. Local policies are, in fact, your local policies. So these are on the local computer. So anything I apply here will actually update your local policies on your local computer. And if I look at these, I could go to security options, and I have all kinds of stuff on here. And that whole Control Delete thing is actually right here. So, you know, this one says do not require Control Delete. Oh, let me back up a bit. By the way, if you notice, all policies are not defined by default. So right now I created a group policy called policy. That's like really creative, guys. Great job. And I have thousands of not defined entries. They're all there. Everyone exists. They're just not defined. And so nothing happens until you define them. So let me go to a policy and assign it. So I'm going to use do not require Control Delete. Now realizing that Control Delete does have valid reasons. None of us like those reasons, and we just want to get rid of them. And so I can enable or define the policy. Once you define the policy, then you enable it or disable it. So here's a do not require Control Delete. This is another thing that Microsoft is good at in group policies, is a lot of negatives. A lot of their statements are negative statements. Do not allow. You're going to see that a lot. Or do not do. Do not display. Here's a require. Restrict this. Do not store. So when you're answering these questions, you have to think of, is that agreeing with that statement or disagreeing with that statement? I think, if I ran Microsoft, I would rather have, say, you know, use Control Delete, yes or no. Here instead it says do not require Control Delete. So what would you answer in this if you don't want it? You enable it, yeah. So if you read it, you're fine. Another thing that's very, very good, Microsoft has done a fantastic job of the Explain tab. They will show you exactly what that group policy object does and tell you in detail what's going to happen when you make the different choices. So in this case, this security setting determines whether pressing Control-Delete is required before a user can log on. If this computer policy is enabled, a user is not required to press Control-Delete. So it tells you, it's like, oh, if it's enabled, they're not required to do this. Now it does tell you the consequences. Not having Control-Delete leaves users susceptible to some types of attacks, though, that attempt to intercept the user's passwords. Requiring Control-Delete before the user logs on ensures that the users are communicating with the means of a trusted path when entering their passwords. So that's why it's there. That's what's been there for years, is just to thwart those kinds of attacks. None of us like it, though, so this is a way of getting rid of it. And then it specifically says if this policy is disabled, any user is required to hit Control-Alt-Delete. So basically that would be, I just hit cancel. I like that. Okay, let's go find it again. Where's my interactive login? Control-Delete. And then I enable, it's like, okay, so now it is enabled, and so you can see that. Another thing is, which we often use, in the classroom, is the whole idea of do not display the last username. Now, this is not the last name of the last user. This is worded a little weird, but the last person who logged in. Now, in most business environments, that's your computer. You walk in, I log onto my desk computer, I log into Paul, and it's fine. And having my name on there is convenient. I turn on my computer, I type my password, and I'm fine. It's also kind of nice saying, like, why is Sam the last person logged onto my account? So it sort of shows you, like, who's the last person logged onto my computer. So that can be valuable and easy that way. There's some downsides of this. One downside is if somebody walks in and turns on your computer, now they have a username to go with. They don't have to guess it. It's already on the screen for them. So now what they do is guess the password. Look underneath the keyboard, and they're probably good to go. The other thing is, like in a classroom environment like these computers are used by different people all the time. I don't want to have the last, username applied, last name showing up all the time. So I'm going to enable this one as well. So I do not want to display the last username. So I'm just going to apply those two things right now, and I'm going to switch over to my Windows 10 client. So right now, here it is. Here's Gopa Daniel, and it shows that person logging in. So let me actually log in as Daniel. And so now, if I restart my computer, the policies would have taken effect. Possibly by him logging in, it's going to take effect as well. But there's other ways of forcing group policies to take effect. One way is from the command prompt, and this is just a normal user thing. You don't need elevated privileges at all. Any user can do this at any time. Group policies happen when you turn on your computer or when you log in, and then roughly every 90 minutes after that it cycles, give or take a 30-minute span as far as updating group policies. Group policies, let's see, how can I say this, are not super reliable as far as being applied. You're going to set a group policy, you're going to reboot, and it's just not there. It might take 2 or 3 reboots to happen. Eventually it'll take effect and it's going to apply. Group policies tend to be long-term implementation things, are not quick fixes. You don't use a group policy to take care of a user's immediate issue because it's not going to apply when you want it or last as long as you want or whatever. It's long-term things. So like in the classroom, I applied a group policy months ago, and there's still some computers that just haven't grabbed them yet. But eventually, months ago was an exaggeration. But there's some policies that just take more logins. Some computers just take more logins to actually get them to apply. One way to force a policy update is to run a GP update, group policy update, and then /force, and that forced the policy to happen. Even using this, you might need to run this like 2 or 3 times to make sure policies take effect. By the way, the other class, like 2 people I think were having some issues with not being able to apply group policies. It ended up being some kind of communication issue between their 2 domain controllers. And by shutting down domain controller 2 and then bringing domain controller 2 back up, it seemed to resolve some of that. I wasn't exactly sure what was going on with that, but just be aware. So now it applied. So let me log off. Let me sign out of my Daniel account. And now you can see that I didn't remember Daniel. So now it brings up a blank login screen, and so now I can log in as anybody. So I don't have to like choose other user or whatever if I go to log in as Hannah or something. And I'll let them create a new profile and move on. So, other things that we can take a look at. I'll show this one to you just because it can be a little complicated, then I'll give you the rest just to explore with. Another one is drive mappings. Drive mappings can be done underneath group policies as well. One thing you'll notice is that you have policies and also preferences. Preferences are relatively new. They've only been available in Server 2012, maybe even R2 and later. So it's only that latest version, the one before that. But they've added preferences. Preferences are truly, in fact, preferences. I would prefer your computer did this, but if you want to change it, you can. But every time you turn on your computer, it's going to get reset back to my preferences, but then you can change it. Before is just policies. Policies are policies. If it says that you don't do this, you don't do it. If I say this icon's not available, you can turn it on. Whereas preferences are in fact just preferences. One of the preferences that we end up using are with drive mappings. So drive mappings. So right now I have Hannah sitting over here. And to log off, I'll cancel for that. So I have Hannah right now, and Hannah, if I go to this PC, doesn't have access to her network stuff. She has to go up here, / data1 / data. And, oh yeah, there's my sales stuff. What user is going to do that? Just not going to happen. You're going to want to give them a drive mapping for that. So if I go to my DC1, and I go to user configuration. This is a user configuration. I go to drive maps. I make a new drive map. There's only a couple things you have to fill in on here. The first one is the location. And I just do data1 data. That's the share, whatever your share name is. So if you called your share HR or sales or whatever your share is, but I have one big share for everything, that's what it is. And then I want to use the letter S. I'll use the letter S. And that's it. That's all I really need to do with that. So now if I go over to my Windows computer over here, I click back on my S drive. How am I going to get that to apply again? Command prompt, okay. Now I have an S drive. So then the S drive just pops up. And so this would happen on the fly or every time the person logs in from now, any person logs in from now on because that policy would apply to them. So now when she goes to this PC, double clicks on the S drive, you'd have access to your sales. Let me log out. I'm going to log back in as Daniel just because I know he has a profile created already. So again, it didn't remember who I was, which is great. So I can log in as Daniel. I go to File Explorer, look at this PC. Here's my S drive, and I have accounting and shared, and so I have access to all the stuff that I want to have access to. And I just threw a shortcut on my desktop. Didn't mean to do that, but that's okay too. As you start perusing around here, you can find a lot of things under Windows, security, local policies, and then security options. You can find a lot of stuff underneath here. Realize you have complete control to the registry. You can add items, delete items, change or update registry keys. You also have a lot of things under administrative templates, like the control panel, personalization, like force specific default lock screen, or prevent changing lock screen, or do not display the lock screen, or force specific start background, regional language, user accounts, networking, all kinds of networking stuff, printers, servers, system, Windows components, all about, here's OneDrive. We talk about all the OneDrive stuff. Save documents to OneDrive by default, so they don't save it locally. Prevent the usage of OneDrive. Say no, don't use OneDrive. And that's all the computer side. And then, like I said, you have a lot of similar things underneath the user side of things. Here's security settings, folder redirection. We do folder redirection. All of these folders are redirected out to the network by default. So all your local stuff is actually pointing someplace else. You also have administrative templates, control panel, system, all kinds of system things, power management, your logon screen, restrict these programs from being launched.
There's even requirements for you if it'll even work.
If it'll, And then again, the preferences, you have all kinds of preferences on here for Windows settings, applications, control panel preferences, devices, whatever. So lots and lots to play with. So in the Learning Plan, it has a couple of things for you to do. It has you look at the there's a password policy to lock accounts after 3 incorrect login attempts. By the way, there's an issue with Windows 10 clients and that. We have not been able to get that to work using Windows 10 client. So still trying to work that out, figure out what's going on with that. But I want you to do it anyway. It's a very, very common policy to apply. So basically saying you have 3 tries or you have 5 tries to get your password, else you're going to lock your account. Here's another one. Log out a user when they hit the end of their allowed logon hours. So for every user, like for Daniel can say work 8 to 5. And so right now we have logon hours 8 to 5. That just means when you can log on. What happens at 5 o'clock? Nothing, unless you apply that policy. Then it forces them to log them out. What's that?
Just Google where they are.
Just Google where they are? Yep, absolutely. Another one is prevent users from running the registry editor. I don't want my users playing the registry. Set the screensaver to require a password. The interactive login message. When you log on to LTC, to the classroom, you get a little message that says, this is the LTC computer use policy or whatever like that. That's the group policy object. In fact, let me show you the classroom one. Let me show you the classroom policies. So we have a group policy called Go to LTC for IT policy. And actually, if I just click on settings, I should be able to show them all. So things that happen are that you get 5 invalid attempts before your password get locked out. Now, whether that works on 10 or not, I should try that in the classroom. It doesn't work in the lab environment. I should try it in the classroom. Here's that whole interactive login. It's LTC computer use policy. That's the message title. And the message text says, this computer and the computer network are owned by LTC, blah, 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 blah. Here's another one that we apply, a machine inactivity limit. It's 420 seconds, which is 7 minutes, which says that if you walk away from your computer during break, it's going to lock it after 7 minutes. So when you come back to your computer, it's going to force you to log back in. Now it keeps you where you were. It's just a screensaver log out, but that's where that comes from. It's being forced at the group policy level. Another policy. These are all your folder redirection. So all of your app data, your contacts, your desktop, all those folders are redirected out to the network. So all of those were configured in here. Here's your S drive. Exactly what we did. It goes to the network share, and it's labeled S, exactly like we did in class. We used to use one that was Z, and we'd still find like all these computers logged in with Z, and having Z still on them. So this group policy says delete that mapping. So realizing that when you add a group policy object item like a drive mapping, if I just deleted this other group policy, you're still going to have the S drive. It's just always going to be there because it's on your computer. You'd actually have to go through the process of deleting and getting rid of it. So, especially things like drive mappings, because those are just preferences. We have another one over here for the computers. So L119 has one. And the only thing in this policy says print to that printer. So when you log on, all the computers in this classroom are automatically mapped to that printer. That's all that group policy is saying. And then if Gordy's computers ever get on the domain, we could force all of his to print to those printers. So
Which I don't think
he'll never do, which is fine, and legitimately so for the things that are going on in there. But I just have these on here because we're teaching it, so we might as well use it.